There are things that we can control and things that we cannot. As people, we have always pushed these limits. The last 65 million years set the last reset in evolution that set our stage with microbes, invertebrates, fungi, fish, plants, and animals. The major evolutionary advances of this era are mammals, flowering and fruiting plants, and grasses. From the time people discovered the use of fire about 500,000 years ago to now, there have been several ice ages and big changes in sea level accompanied by changes in animal and plant composition. Large groups of people in cities and roaming tribes became a significant force in nature, and unmechanized people accomplished great feats harnessing the forces of nature. Nature has shown booms and busts. We as people should gauge ecological health, sustainability, and diversity to avoid a fate similar to collapsed societies of the past. People have a higher order of complexity related to background creatures by way of ability to communicate and record and refine actionable information. This way we can recognize trends over time and generations, and our thought process transcends the individual experience. Since the Industrial Revolution about 400 years ago, people amassed specialized understanding of the physical laws of nature and used it to mine the earth for building blocks, as if the earth is a stationary parts store rather than a living system. Our rate of consumption continues in an accelerated crescendo, with depletion rates clearly registering on the whole system scale. To avoid a natural bust, we need to look at adjustments to our interaction with the whole system. So let's consider ecological function. People reached the Americas relatively late, at about 12,000 years ago. The glacial retreat that occurred in Eurasia about 13,000 years ago was happening in North America about 10,000 years ago, and marks the final decline of the megafauna. Palomar Mountain appears to have been settled by humans at least 5,000 years ago. This mountain is a granite uplift from the former plains. This creates an uplift that lifts the moist air blowing onshore from the Pacific and precipitates rain, the essential ingredient for life. Water will condense in the presence of any surface below the dew point. When water falls on bare soil, it will percolate down to the aquifer, will run off, or will be evaporated by the sun. A prime constituent to life is to retain water in a body that resists gravity. The basic building blocks for these bodies are hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon, just like the sun's CNO cycle, in the form of fat, cellulose, protein, and sugar. There is a special relationship between these elements that compose life on Earth. Oxygen is abundant on Earth from the inner core and out. Hydrogen floats up, and if it is not bonded to another element such as oxygen to create water, it will percolate the atmosphere and get carried off by the solar wind. And it's also replenished through proton emission, a type of radioactive decay. Carbon is a bit more anomalous. Carbon does not appear common below the crust, and there was relatively low concentration of carbon during Earth's initial accretion. There is evidence to suggest that the carbon concentration at the surface has risen over Earth's lifespan. The prevailing theory is that the added carbon comes to Earth from outside, primarily in the form of carbonaceous chondrites. When these meteors strike the Earth's atmosphere, the carbon fuses to oxygen in the air and reaches its lowest energy state, CO2, which settles to the lower atmosphere. The partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere drives carbon into the oceans in the form of carbonic acid, CH2O3. Life-containing chlorophyll can take carbon dioxide, 6CO2, combine it with water, 12H2O, and output oxygen, 6O2, and glucose, C6H12O6, empirically CH2O. This is the basis for most organisms and organic chemistry. The sugar created from photosynthesis is metabolized and forms more complex carbon chains such as fat and proteins that form both hydrophilic and hydrophobic surfaces. Marine life can also combine carbon with calcium to form calcium carbonate, CaCO3. Organisms metabolize organic material and respire CO2 by combining the carbon atom from a sugar molecule, CH2O, with O2 to produce CO2, carbon dioxide, H2O, water, and heat. The mass balance is such that a lot more carbon is captured by organisms, concentrated, and is isolated from the atmosphere than is respired. The carbon consumed by life in body and excrement is removed from the partial pressure equilibrium between the CO2 in the atmosphere and the carbonic acid, CH2O3, in the oceans. Plants pull water and nitrogen from the ground, use light from the sun to combine it with CO2 from the air, and release O2 and water vapor into the air. This action causes evaporative cooling and reduces plant cell temperatures below ambient and has a cascade cooling effect in the shaded area. When a plant surface drops below the dew point, the leaf surface condenses water. While water in the atmosphere can condense on the surface of dust particles to precipitate rain, the surface to volume ratio of a pollen particle is much greater, so that a lot more precipitation can occur in the presence of a forest. The forest increases the stationary presence of water in the following way. Rain falls in the forest and percolates down to the ground and is absorbed by carbonaceous material. When it evaporates from the soil and strikes the surface of a leaf below the dew point, it condenses and drips back down to the ground. Water that evaporates above the forest canopy, including by evapotranspiration, can be recaptured by forest particles and return as rain. Animals in the forest consume and concentrate carbon-based material in the forest. Their deposits mix with the material on the surface and create hydrophilic water sponge material and hydrophobic membranes that keep water on the surface. This regulates surface water. This way, the forest brings rain, retains water, controls its temperature, and provides food and shelter for its ecosystem. Optimal ecosystem health is a system that has well-regulated water and temperature, abundant variety of life forms with a low parasite rate. A parasite is a relation between organisms where one organism takes a relatively small amount of material from another and causes it reproductive harm or death. With a variety of life forms, a lot of creative niches can be filled in the forest to perform the primary function of life, to pull carbon out of the air and deposit it in an inanimate non-CO2 form. Example: a tree uses sunlight to absorb CO2, combine it with water to produce glucose and oxygen, and cooling thermal energy. Plants build complex carbon material that feeds animals that break it down and excrete it onto the soil. This makes nitrogen available in the soil for the plants, disperses and fertilizes plant seeds, and sinks carbon into the ground. Predators and scavengers regulate the presence of unhealthy parasite host members among a population and reduces carbon to the soil through body and excretion. The local ecosystem on Palomar is a 5-million-year-old watershed in Southern California. As the mountain pushes up, the granite block pushes the former plains crust out of its way, and the updraft it causes brings rain. The mineral slurry mixes with the organic material created out of the mountain air, washes down the mountain, and brings fertility to the valley and seabed below. People likely arrived at Palomar when the megafauna was still here 12,000 years ago and survived through the decline and extinction of the large animals. Before the Spanish arrived, this region had a patchwork of tribes that had established summer and winter rotations over the region. There is evidence of human habitation at the Harrison Serenity Ranch for thousands of years where people would typically camp during the summer. People fanned out about the land and moved back and forth across the land seasonally, performing an ecological function in regulating certain aspects of the land for their own nutritional benefits. At some time between the establishment of the Spanish mission and the creation of the state of California, the local tribes were deprived of their traditional routes and were confined to reservations. The government of Mexico and then the state of California gave land grants to new settlers, Nate Harrison being the first on this land. By now, the ecology has changed. The practice of the people stopped facilitating the flow of carbon-absorbed material from the mountain to the ocean. With insufficient large animal interaction in the forest, tree limbs and grasses dry and cast a dark shadow on the ground below. Without enough demand for the organic material produced by the forest, the dead members accumulate and have a reduced capacity to hold water, and when the flammability levels rise to catastrophic, they erupt into megafires, further drying the land and reducing biological output.